Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and this is going to be a great interview, folks. I can tell you already. As many of you know, Chief Midegah burst on the scene about a year and a half ago, and it's really started a lot of different conversations. And actually, one of the conversations that's going to start here on NBR is talking to Indigenous voices, which I think is really, really important. And this is the beginning of a series of not only talking about Indigenous voices, but also with Indigenous voices. We're also going to be doing a future interview with Elise Boxer, her book, Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. Also, we want to hear minority voices. Another book that was just sent to me is Mormon Barrio. That will be something we'll be discussing. And Thomas is going to be a special co-host in the next few weeks where we're going to interview Darren Perry. So Native American voices are really important, and they're undertold stories in the restoration. And I really feel that Midegah kind of helped in his own way put a spotlight on it. And also just there's so many issues with cultural appropriation and all these things that we're going to talk about that are very sensitive. I also want to let people know that I have been talking to Indigenous members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We're going to have them on the program as well. So this is an important conversation we're going to have. Before we get started, I just want to remind people that there's a special code in the description for the Echo water hydration flask. You put in the code Mormon Book Reviews and you'll get 10% off. I don't get money for this, but you get 10% off. I just get a flask, but I've been using it for a couple months and I've noticed it does seem to have some health benefits. So I want to mention that. And just want to let people know that I'm going to be making a trip to Utah soon. So stay tuned for that. March 19th through the 26th, we'll be doing some collaborations with other podcasters. And also we'll probably be doing some meetups. I'm hoping to do one in Salt Lake City as well as one in St. George because I've been wanting to get to southern Utah. My good friend, Thomas Murphy, returns to the program today. And Thomas has been, like, when I say good friend, I mean that. We've become very close friends. And we've had, early days of the whole Midegah thing. You and I have been talking and just kind of comparing notes. And you've really taught me the importance of, like, Indigenous voices, federally unrecognized tribes, and the struggles and the battles they go through, and the empathy and sympathy you have for those movements. There are currently federally unrecognized Native American tribes that one day will be. And so there is a process that's occurring. And I think it's really important. But also, we have the rise of the pretendian. And it seems like so many of the visible Native American voices throughout the decades, going back for at least 50 years, often turn out that they weren't. And that's been an issue that's been going on as well. So these are sensitive topics, and I think one of the best people to bring on board to address these is my friend Thomas Murphy, who's got a new book coming out published by University of Utah Press, which will help inform this conversation. Thomas, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Steve. I am so delighted to join you and to share a little bit about an article that I've written that's quite relevant to these discussions that Chief Midegah or David Taylor has inspired within the restoration movement. Mm-hmm. And I'm excited to talk about an article and a book. And I want to make the material relevant to your audience. I want to reflect on some of the issues that David Taylor has brought forward and how my research can be helpful for those who would like to see a scholarly perspective on these issues. And so I'm really delighted and honored to join you. And I also greatly appreciate these efforts, this collaboration that we are starting to bring some more Indigenous and Latino voices to Mormon Book Reviews. I've been working in Indigenous communities for about 40 years now. And as an anthropologist, I've done field work in both Mesoamerica and in the Heartland. And I'm a professional anthropologist with a PhD in anthropology from the University of Washington. I live in the Seattle area in the traditional lands of the Coast Salish peoples. My current book is Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. It's actually my first book that it's solely authored by me. I have articles in about 10 other anthologies where I've written essentially a chapter of another book, but this will be the
Oh,
first book solely authored by
oh,
me.
oh, congratulations, Thomas. I didn't realize that. You've published so much. I never thought about that. So, yeah, this is a big deal, man. University of Utah Press, your first solo authorship. And these books, by the way, this book will be available in June. And for those of you who are going to be attending the Mormon History Association, Thomas will be there, and you can even get a signed copy from him for that. So, we're excited about that. And this year, I think MHA is in Las Vegas. So, Sin City, here we
Indeed.
come.
Yeah.
Great.
With a city with a quite a fascinating Mormon history too. So
Absolutely. Yeah,
yeah.
that's an undertold story that I hope to dig into a little bit as well. I did have Jim Bennett come on to talk about Mormonism's relationship with Howard Hughes and the Vegas connection as well. So yeah, but there's a lot of undertold stories about Mormonism and Las Vegas. So well, why don't you get started, Thomas? This is exciting. I'll interject now and then, or maybe seek clarification or have questions. But I'd like for you just to kind of tell my audience this story of Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon, and Midegah and Misappropriation.
Yes, what I want to do is introduce the topic by discussing an article that I have published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. The article is entitled White is an Ite, White is an Ite, the Book of Mormon's Misappropriation of the Iroquois Great Law of Peace. This appeared in the winter 2025 issue of Dialogue. It's available online for free at dialoguejournal.com. So for those who would like to see my sources in particular, and to follow the footnotes, to dig deeper, the online article is the best way to go. For those that prefer an audio recording, I collaborated with Latter Daily Digest to do a reading of the article in my own voice. That's available both at Latter Daily Digest and at my YouTube channel, my very tiny, small YouTube channel, Dr. T.W. Murphy. If you watch it there, please subscribe. I have maybe 20 subscribers, so it's a pretty small
Hey,
little thing. But if there's an interest, I would be happy to read more of my articles or share more content on that page. But that gives an audio option basically for those who would prefer to hear it.
and we'll have links in the description
Right.
for that as well in the show notes.
Yeah, and my slideshow that I'm sharing here, I'm going to put up on academia.edu, which is a social media site for scholars to share their materials. So you can use the slideshow to follow the links as well. But this article kind of, as the title suggests, tries to make whiteness visible in the Book of Mormon, because we imagine the society that's created by Jesus's appearance in the Book of Mormon
Mm-hmm.
as a society that is in which there are no manner of ites.
Uh-huh.
Yet the society is also depicted as white, and that's a bit of a conundrum, a bit of a, how can you be white and have no manner of ites if in fact white is an ite? So that's kind of the conundrum that the article wrestles with. Now, it has some important implications for David Taylor's deployment of Iroquois peacemaker narratives as historical evidence for the Book of Mormon. For example, in his appearance a couple months ago here on your program, Mormon Book Reviews, he referred on multiple occasions to these Iroquois peacemaker narratives as evidence for the Book of Mormon. I'm going to show it's a little more complicated than he has presented it, and maybe in ways that might make some members of the Restoration movement uncomfortable, but ones that, as in my work as a scholar, that I've had to wrestle with. And so I want to share my wrestles and some of the evidence that I've encountered that lead me to take a little different approach than most I would say pious approaches to the Book of Mormon as an ancient document. I tend to see it based upon my research, and of course we've talked about my DNA research and others here before. But based upon my research, I see the Book of Mormon as a 19th century document. That doesn't prevent it from being read as scripture in a devotional manner by any means, but it does present a reading of the Book of Mormon that is more in tune with the archaeology, more in tune with the genetics, and the historical record. And that's kind of my approach as a scholar.
Thanks for sharing that, Thomas. Yeah, I think it's important that we do have all the voices on here, and here here at MBR, we don't weaponize history. We don't weaponize these programs against the restoration. We want to help inform the restoration and the members of what the latest research is on these important subjects.
Thank you. Yeah. So the article is a synthesis of a couple of chapters of my book and some of the theoretical ideas behind it. So the book, again, is Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. It is coming out by June. It'll be available as you've already mentioned at the Mormon History Association, where I'll be signing autographs. The book, Unsettling Scripture, takes critical Indigenous studies methodology and applies it to the study of the Book of Mormon. It's actually the second book to do that. The first came out more recently, and that is Elise Boxer's Mormon Settler Colonialism, Inventing the Lamanite. So it kind of follows in her footsteps in applying critical Indigenous studies to the Book of Mormon. But it is the first book to look at the Book of Mormon within the context of Haudenosaunee or Iroquois oral traditions, and to put the two of them into dialogue with each other. That dialogue is complicated because the predominant Iroquois explanation for the Book of Mormon is that they shared their stories with Joseph Smith that then he appropriated and incorporated into the Book of Mormon.
Okay, so I think it's important that this is part of Iroquois native history or their oral history, or what people have talked about, that they actually believe that they told Joseph Smith these stories, and then Joseph put these in the Book of Mormon. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So we're gonna examine that from the perspective of the historical record, as well as some examples of where those positions have been articulated in U.S. political history.
Okay.
Now, the book is available for pre-order, and the University of Utah Press is offering MBR listeners a 25% discount if you use the discount code Murphy25, and you do so specifically at the University of Utah Press's website. So there's a QR code on the screen that you can scan. That'll take you directly to the University of Utah Press website, where you can order with that discounted price. You can also read the reviews that are available there, and I want to highlight one of them. That is from Darren Bonaparte, who is a Mohawk scholar and former elected chief at Akwesasne in New York. And this is one of the most famous of the Iroquois nations. He is the author of a book called Creation and Confederation, The Living History of Iroquois. That was an important guide for me in the construction of the book and a model for how to approach difficult topics. And Darren has been a valuable colleague and correspondent in my work, and has read early drafts of the material as well as the final product of the book. And he writes, and I'm going to quote here, "In what will certainly be one of the most provocative and shocking books to mention the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, Thomas W. Murphy delves into the most infamous case of cultural appropriation that ever took place, the revelations recorded by Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon. Murphy goes beyond the similarities to the visions of Handsome Lake, a late 18th century Seneca prophet, and suggests the stories Smith told about the kingmen and freemen were actually about how the American Revolution unfolded in Iroquois. Many of us have wondered about what inspired Smith, but Murphy is the first scholar to really go there.
Hmm.
End quote. Yeah, that's a strong endorsement, and I think a critique too of my work, because I uh, I've tried to be very careful in how I present the problems,
Mm-hmm.
and I do show many similarities and differences with Haudenosaunee oral tradition. But what he really kind of comes back is this is a cultural appropriation. This is the stealing, the taking without permission of the stories of Iroquois people and putting them into the Book of Mormon in that form. So it's kind of it's amplifying, I guess, the evidence that I've gone through, and kind of giving an indigenous critique of the Book of Mormon.
And just real quick too, just so you know, Haudenosaunee is the name that they actually refer to themselves. Iroquois is the name that was given to, or Iroquois was given to by the French. So that's why we have the two names here, just to clarify that too.
And there's also another couple of common names, Five Nations and Six Nations, and those are the terms used by the English. So they're originally Five Nations, and later the Tuscarora joined, and it'll make Six Nations. And I'll go over that a little bit
Okay.
in more detail as we go along. So let's dive into the article. I begin with some quotes from the Book of Mormon itself, particularly 4th Nephi. And now, behold, it came to pass that the people of Nephi became an exceeding fair and delightsome people. Neither were there Lamanites nor any manner of ites, but they were one, the children of Christ. That's 4th Nephi 1:10 and 17. This passage comes from kind of the climax, if you will, of the Book of Mormon, where you have Jesus appearing to ancient Americans and sharing a gospel very similar to that we find in the New Testament here in the Americas. And he creates this, or helps the community create a society where everybody owns everything in common. Is kind of a utopian Christian community.
Yeah. I call it a proto millennium.
Right.
Really is
Yeah.
how I look
Yeah.
at it. And so it's kind of shows like this is the ideal world that they actually created, a proto millennium in the new world that lasted around 200 years. And one of the key things was that there were no more any manner of ites, and that was a really important key thing there.
Yeah. So the Book of Mormon narrative itself is divided. It has this long-standing division between Lamanites and Nephites. Lamanites being a dark-skinned, cursed people, the Nephites being a light-skinned, civilized people. And they were both descendants of Lehi, Lehi being the founding father of the Book of Mormon, and two of his sons, Nephi and Laman, become the progenitors of these ancient feuding nations, or ites, Lamanites and Nephites. And so this vision that the Book of Mormon presents is one of people being able to come together and to become one. This is also a Haudenosaunee vision. Okay, there is a peacemaker in Haudenosaunee traditions that unifies the five nations to make them one. But there are some big differences, particularly in the racializations between the Book of Mormon and the Haudenosaunee traditions.
And, I think too, Thomas, it's important to talk about the context of the 19th century in which there was thought that there were whites that were wiped out. And I know you talk about that, but also just during this period of time in the 19th century, a lot of the religions that came out, like the Seventh-day Adventists, like the Jehovah's Witnesses, and others also taught similar doctrines that basically you would become white uh, in their cases in the afterlife in heaven. Everybody be white. As a matter of fact, as a child, we used to sing a song, "Wash me and I'll become whiter than snow." So this was part of that world that existed not only in the Book of Mormon, this understanding of what this means, but the idea of having white skin was affiliated with holiness, and dark skin was with evil. So I think it's really important that people understood this in a pretty literal understanding back then.
Especially European settlers understood
Mm-hmm.
it that way, right? And so that's particularly important, as we'll see in my interpretation. So I'm interested in this conundrum. How can you have no manner of ites, yet everybody is presented as becoming fair and delightsome, as becoming essentially
Mm-hmm.
white?
Yep.
And so there's some interesting recent scholarship from colleagues that I deeply admire, but I also resist some of their interpretations of the Book of Mormon. And these are Max Perry Mueller, whose excellent book, Race and the Making of the Mormon People, deals with this same passage in 4th Nephi. And he argues that Lamanites and Nephites unified to become one raceless, he puts white in parentheses, Christian people. And he argues that white is presented as the original and universal racial category. That's how he's reading the Book of Mormon. Michael Austin, in his book, The Testimony of Two Nations, builds upon Mueller's interpretation to argue that the Book of Mormon curse of a dark skin is reversible and tied clearly to continuing behavior. And, and he contends it injected something genuinely new in the divine curse as racial etiology genre of scripture. And he kind of celebrates this idea of the mutability of races within the Book of Mormon, because and you see a bit of this in Mueller as well, because what does happen in racial rhetoric in the United States, especially in the mid 19th century, ideas about race become very hardened in the sense that you are simply one race and that's it. It's like it's a deterministic view of races that predominates in the latter part of the 19th century and well into the 20th century, and a very biologically determinist view of race. But the Book of Mormon presents a view that's a little bit older. It's an 18th century idea about race that is that races are more mutable, that they are environmentally influenced and culturally influenced, and so that what one's race can change over time.
Mm-hmm.
And I in researching this topic, my entry point into it is actually investigating the stories of my own ancestors, who, as I learned from my grandma and great grandfather, we had what they called an Iroquois princess or a Lamanite princess, or an Indian princess is the term we also heard
Mm-hmm.
in our family tree. And now, when I heard that as a child, that was kind of really cool. I thought I could relate to the Book of Mormon as being the story of my ancestors. But as I got into college, and especially as I read scholars like the Dakota scholar Vine Deloria, he kind of makes fun of these people who claim to have an Indian princess in their family tree, and fairly so. And so I wanted to investigate. I guess my approach as a scholar is when things get difficult, that's when I dive in, right? That's when I want to really
Mm-hmm.
understand what's going on. And so I dove into those family histories, into the genealogical work done by my mother and my grandmother, to try to better understand the actual people behind those stories. And as I dug into those stories, I actually found that there was some kind of mutability or race shifting occurring back in the 18th century in our family line, because some of my ancestors, according to the records of the genealogists, were taken captive by the Mohawks during the Revolutionary War. And one of my direct ancestors, Thomas Ferguson, appears to have married a woman, Mary Ferguson, who was possibly Mary Manton, who was also a captive at the same time during the Revolutionary War, and she was the child of another captive, a woman from the Cherry Valley area in Western New York, who had been taken captive and married a Mohawk man. And so in the lives of my ancestors, Thomas spent 7 years in Mohawk communities, was adopted into Mohawk families, identified, understood himself as a Mohawk during a formative portion of his life, from basically through his most of his early teen years. And then after the war, he's brought back to the Mohawk Valley and has to adjust to this setting where he's going from being white to being Mohawk to being white again.
Oh, wow.
And so you do see that mutability of races in 18th century America, or in terms of people's identities shifting. And I think I see the Book of Mormon as reflecting that context. And so I only briefly mentioned the family histories in the article, but I go into a lot more depth in a couple of chapters in the book and use that family history to better understand what was going on. But as I was investigating that family history, I also kept coming across these Haudenosaunee oral traditions that also appear in the Book of Mormon. And some of them were stories about the Revolutionary War. So they were recent part of oral history, and some harken back to an earlier time. So I wanted to piece these apart and to better understand what was happening in these communities. And so as I approach the topic, I've been heavily influenced by critical Indigenous scholarship. And I argue in the article that when viewed within the context of critical Indigenous studies and the literary record of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Great Law of Peace, the Book of Mormon narrator Mormon's portrait of a seemingly raceless society looks a little too much like a settler colonial body politic that erases Indigenous cultures and identities. And what I want to say is that even though I believe the Book of Mormon story was inspired by the Haudenosaunee oral tradition, that it missed portions of it. And as Joseph Smith incorporated these stories, he left out portions. Maybe he didn't hear them, or maybe he didn't recognize them. But what you get is basically a whitewashed version of the Iroquois traditions in the Book of Mormon, and one that emphasizes the perspective of European settlers over that of Indigenous peoples, and that elevates whiteness as an identity to be aspired towards, rather than a colonizing force with a military backing it up that's taking lands and expropriating resources. So the article also argues the false narrative that one can be white, or I put or pure, because Joseph Smith actually changed some passages in the Book of Mormon in 1840 from white to pure. So even Joseph Smith was questioning his own racial politics. But so the false narrative that one can be white or pure and raceless has done considerable harm to Indigenous communities, particularly when Latter-day Saint politicians in the mid-20th century drew from these same teachings in the Book of Mormon to construct a settler colonial state policy of termination directed towards erasing Indigenous sovereignty in the United States. In other words, more Latter-day Saint politicians used the Book of Mormon as a model for U.S. federal Indian policy of termination, in which they wanted to eradicate Indigenous sovereignty and eliminate tribal governments. And as they were advocating this policy, Indigenous activists who resisted termination did so in part by identifying the Book of Mormon as an overly Christianized variant of a larger body of Haudenosaunee oral tradition describing the Peacemaker's unification of 5 nations: the Mohawks, the Oneidas, the Onondagas, the Cayugas, and the Senecas. So let's explore a little bit of who these people are who are called Iroquois or the Haudenosaunee. This map shows you the traditional and current territories of the Haudenosaunee nations. Again, Haudenosaunee is the name they use for themselves. Iroquois is the name applied by the French. 5 or 6 nations are the names applied by the English. This confederation of nations extended across much of Western New York into portions of Pennsylvania, Ontario, and Quebec. And you can see kind of going from about the Hudson River west in upstate New York. You have at the eastern door of a longhouse, the Mohawk Nation. Next, you have the Oneidas. And the Oneidas, interestingly, are mentioned very specifically. Oneida is mentioned as a place name in the Book of Mormon. And in my book, I go into a lot of the context of that. The Onondaga, who are the central fire, the unifying the nation at which the council fire is held.
And just real quick, Onondaga is also referenced by Joseph Smith regarding Zelph's Mound.
Right.
That Zelph, the white Lamanite, served under that name Onondagas, some general named Onondagas or something. So we do also outside the Book of Mormon a reference that Joseph Smith uses to that as well.
Indeed, right. And then the Cayugas and the Senecas. And most of the founding events of the Restoration occurred within Seneca territory. Of course, there was a fair amount of activity, especially Joseph Smith's treasure digging that occurred in the Susquehanna Valley, which is down in this region that was Mohawk and Oneida territory as well. And there were some Tuscaroras there as well. So the Tuscaroras, who make up that sixth nation, they joined in the 18th century, early 18th century. And so they were not a part of the original confederation, but they were close relatives. And they later get adopted into the Haudenosaunee Longhouse. Today, after the American Revolution, this land base is quickly decreased by the growth of the United States aggressively, and the United States basically treated most of the Shawnee people who fought on the side of the British as losers in a war, expropriated much of their land.
Okay.
They did manage through treaty to reserve some of the traditional lands. Today, you can find some reservations scattered throughout, and they're indicated here on the map.
Okay, so basically the spots that are in purple, those little purple boxes and stuff, those are currently reservations
and reserves.
Oh, reserves. Okay, great.
Yeah, they use the term reserve in Canada, reservations in the United States.
Oh, thank you.
Okay. And so these are where the reservations and reserves are today.
Okay.
Now, some of the people were removed to Wisconsin and to other parts of Ontario, and so you do see Haudenosaunee people as well in Wisconsin, which will be important for a later part of the story. So when we look at the Haudenosaunee oral traditions of the Peacemaker, the Peacemaker is the one who leads the founding of the Five Nations. We get a less Christianized version. There are certainly Christian elements to it, but we get a less Christianized version. And most importantly, none of the authentic Haudenosaunee versions depict the Peacemaker as white or portray an ancient white civilization on Turtle Island, or imagine a white settler society as the ultimate goal of peacemaking endeavors. And so this is where Joseph Smith's role as himself a descendant of European settlers, he's trying to understand as he sticks his face into a hat uh, and has visions and revelation or of the materials that he dictates as the Book of Mormon. I I try to give him benefit of the doubt that I think he believed in what he was doing. In fact, he was actually mimicking Haudenosaunee prophets like the Seneca prophet Handsome Lake, who also would bury items under a skin and hold out to exclude the light and engage in divination processes.
Hmm.
And I think he truly is trying to connect with the indigenous dead
Hmm.
through this method of divination, but I don't think he's able to escape kind of his own settler prejudices. And so those stories that were prevalent among Europeans of an ancient white civilization, the idea that Jesus might be white, although that's really hard to substantiate even with the New Testament itself, but you see it very explicitly stated in the Book of Mormon, and or the idea that we ought to all become one settler nation of the United States. Those are all the assumptions that Joseph Smith's cultural background is bringing to that experience, and in that sense, he misappropriates Haudenosaunee tradition as he reworks it, as he whitewashes it into something that is palatable to himself and to the people that would follow him.
Okay, interesting. Very interesting,
Now,
Thomas.
this image here I want to just point out is
Yeah.
coming from a book called The Traditional Teachings. This was produced by the North American Native North American Traveling College at Akwesasne, New York, which that picture of myself and Darren Bonaparte earlier was taken there at Native North American Traveling College at Akwesasne.
Okay.
And that book was actually used by the one branch of the Restoration, the True and Live, the TLC they call it, the True and Living Church of, I forget they do the acronym a little bit differently, but this is a group in Manti, Utah,
Hmm.
that adopted the traditional teachings alongside the Book of Mormon. And these images here of the Peacemaker and the tree are coming directly from that book.
Okay, very interesting. Is that TLC group still around?
Yes, they are. I'd love to have you interview some of
Oh,
their folks.
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
know
see.
Christopher Blythe has done a lot of work with them, so
Okay,
maybe you can
great.
interview him about them as well.
Yeah, I'll reach out to Christopher. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So in the Haudenosaunee tradition, the Confederation of Five Nations, or the League as it's called, is envisioned as a shared longhouse, with again the Mohawks at that eastern door, and then at the western door you have the Senecas with the Onondagas in the hosting the central fire, and that each nation exists within that longhouse, but they have their own space and their own sovereignty within that longhouse. And that's something that gets lost in the Book of Mormon version. So the Haudenosaunee narratives depict the league initiated by the Peacemaker as a shared longhouse where each nation maintains its own sovereignty and is led by matrilineal clan mothers who manage the communal ownership of land, and they select a council of 50 men
Hmm.
to govern the Confederacy by consensus.
Hmm.
Now, you might notice that Council of 50 is something that also reappears in
Yes.
Mormonism when Joseph Smith tries to create his own Council of 50 to govern the kingdom of God in
Hmm.
Nauvoo. And
Fascinating.
only the Book of Mormon and a couple of secondhand settler colonial versions of the Great Law of Peace that we'll get to discuss towards the end of this presentation from the 20th century associate the Peacemaker or the League with whiteness. So this narrative of whiteness is imposed upon an indigenous original, the Haudenosaunee original.
Okay, let's keep it going. This is interesting stuff. Okay, I think this is key. And actually, you and I have had conversations about this very thing. I think there's some really significant verses in the Book of Mormon that you're covering here, and
Mhm.
how they're transposed onto this story is fascinating to me. So please explain the significance of burying the weapons of war. That's a connection I
Yeah,
never.
that's a Haudenosaunee diplomacy, act of diplomacy that is prevalent in many stories throughout the Book of Mormon, right? Is this idea that when they're trying to build peace, they're going to bury their weapons of war. Well, this was introduced by the Peacemaker. And you see here another image from traditional teachings where the white pine tree is uprooted and the weapons of war are thrown in and buried underneath the great tree of peace, and then the roots of that great tree of peace spread out and help to unify more people. And so in the Haudenosaunee versions, you have the key characters, uh, Ianwatha, who's often anglicized as Hiawatha, Sikonsase, or the Mother of Nations, and Tekanawita, who is typically the one identified as the Peacemaker, unify the five nations through a ceremonial cycle, through common property managed by a matrilineal clan system, and the burial of weapons of war under a great tree of peace. So readers of the Book of Mormon may note that the story there appropriates the symbols of bearing weapons, of communal property, and even a great tree, but not the ceremonial cycle or the clans under female leadership. Those are left out of the Book of Mormon, but they're critical ingredients to the recipe for peace in Haudenosaunee traditions.
Yeah, and I just this is when I've heard about this burial of weapons story being part of that tradition, I was really amazed by it. But another reading of this, and I just to kind of put my more I don't know faithful cap, I don't know,
Yeah.
but there are Heartlanders that could read your materials and say that the Book of Mormon is actually did take place in the Heartlander model because it reflects these stories that they could argue are based on ancient sources that were also passed down by the Iroquois that could stretch back in time. So that's kind of, or that they continued the traditions that happened in the Book of Mormon. So that's one reading that one could take. Of course, you being taking the more scholarly approach, you're looking at it as this story influencing the Book of Mormon. So kind of look at it through two different lenses there.
Well, and I didn't come to that perspective from the start. You know,
Uh huh.
that's after looking at the evidence.
Okay.
So
Look.
and I have pictured here Darren Bonaparte's excellent book, Creation and Confederation: The Living History of the Iroquois. So for those who really want to dive into the historical sources, what Darren Bonaparte does is take those earliest historical references to the founding of the league and show how they have changed over time. And what's really critical, what he shows very importantly for reading the Book of Mormon, is that in the earliest versions of the Haudenosaunee tradition, that Ianwata, Sikonsase, Tekanawita were just ordinary human beings. And
Mm.
I think I have that in a later slide. So I'll get into that a little more in a later slide. But they were ordinary human beings who become, under the Second Great Awakening, deified and associated with Jesus.
Ah. Okay.
Okay. And so, because that's a historical transition that happens very shortly before the Book of Mormon is published, that actually helps us understand the Book of Mormon within the historical context of the literary record of Haudenosaunee traditions. And
Okay.
again, I will get into more detail on that in a future slide. But I do want to, before I go into that, I want to explain a little more about my theoretical perspective, because it informs my approach. I am exercising a preference for for indigenous stories from their own voices. And if people want to criticize me for that, it's a fair criticism. Okay. But I think it's an important methodology because in the way that we've told the stories of Mormon origins, we've left out those indigenous voices. And actually, indigenous people, Haudenosaunee in particular, have stories about how Mormons came to be that we ought to read alongside the stories that the Book of Mormon presents about how American Indians came to be.
Mm.
And there is a group of scholars that are trying to do this. Many of them indigenous, and many are members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and active participants in that, including Elise Boxer, who we've already mentioned. And so I want to highlight some of their research, and I want to emphasize that reading the Book of Mormon critically, even reading it as a 19th century document, does not preclude a faithful approach. One can have a devotional approach to the Book of Mormon that sees it as scripture, but also reads it in a 19th century historical context. And many of the scholars that I'm going to highlight are very comfortable with that type of an approach. And they're also using their experiences as indigenous people, as scholars, to think critically about kind of the racial politics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the other members of the Restoration movement. Moroni Benali, who is a Dene scholar who wrote an article for Dialogue, a journal of Mormon thought, called Decolonizing the Blossoming, Indigenous People's Faith in a Colonizing Church, that I highly recommend. He argues that the Book of Mormon often functions as a tool of erasure for Indigenous people's rightful claim to land, politics, economies, and power. So, and if we take him seriously, we have to be wary of the way that the Book of Mormon erases, even as it features Lamanite, it also erases actual indigenous stories. And so what I'm trying to do is trying to look behind that erasure, to take the Haudenosaunee stories alongside the Book of Mormon, and in their original forms, at least as far as they've been preserved, and put that in dialogue with the text that we see in the Book of Mormon. Hemopyrrhiki Simon, who would be a great scholar to interview here, as well as a Maori scholar who's written a series of articles kind of challenging the settler bias in Mormon studies. And he argues that the Book of Mormon exemplifies a religious environment that reproduces the hidden racial ontology that operates as a discourse of silencing by elevating the voices of Nephite narrators like Mormon, Moroni, Nephi, that we're silencing the voices of actual indigenous peoples. And you can use it in the Book of Mormon. That actually wrestles with this a little bit in the story of Samuel the Lamanite, who I think is modeled after some actual indigenous people, a Mohegan sachem by the name of Samson Occam. And there's also some similarities with William Apis, a Pequot minister as well. And you see kind of Samuel the Lamanite playing this role of challenging the Nephites, presenting his critiques. He's standing on a wall critiquing the Nephites, taking their barbs and arrows and weapons, and preaching a gospel to them, a Christian gospel, as they become more wicked than the Lamanites. And so the Book of Mormon is playing with this. The Book of Mormon narrative is playing with this really interesting phenomenon that did happen in 18th and 19th century America, of these indigenous preachers, Samson Occam and William Apis being some of the more prominent ones, critiquing Christianity using the Bible as a tool for criticizing settler colonialism in the early United States. And interestingly, in the Book of Mormon, Jesus, the character represented as Jesus, also critiques the Nephites for silencing Samuel the Lamanite, not including his other scriptures that he had preached about in their narrative. So, that to me is a fascinating aspect of the text. Whether you
Yeah.
read it anciently or allegorically, it has uh, important implications even within the complicated text itself, that we need to take Indigenous voices seriously, yet we still continue to erase Indigenous voices. How many times have you actually sat down and read the traditional teachings alongside the Book of Mormon?
Yeah, that's really interesting,
It
Thomas. To
doesn't
make these
typically
connections.
happen, even though the Book of Mormon itself, you could argue, says we should.
Yes. Yeah,
And you know,
precisely.
to give another example, the Kanaka Hawaii, or Native Hawaiian scholar Hukalani Akua argues that the persistence of Mormon whiteness is a part and parcel of a settler colonial project intent on the territorial expropriation of native land. So she's drawing attention to the way that Mormon settlers continue to want to legitimize the taking of indigenous lands. And one of the ways that the Book of Mormon does this, and Elise Boxer talks about this a fair amount in her work, including Mormon settler colonialism, is that it presents the original peoples of the Americas as if they were white. And so it creates this uh, primordial whiteness that helps to give the settlers a sense of belonging on stolen land.
Hmm.
And so I think for me, in reading and engaging with these Indigenous scholars has helped me to think critically about my own position as a member of settler colonial society. Yes, I do have some Indigenous ancestry, but it's distant. And I was raised as white. I was taught that we had become white and delightsome, right? And so I need to approach this material much more critically. So these are some sources that I recommend people that want to get more Indigenous perspectives. In the article, I also highlight two anthologies: Decolonizing Mormonism, uh, edited by uh, Gina Colvin and Joanna Brooks, and a book called Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, edited by P. Jane Hafen, a Taos Pueblo scholar, and Brendan Rensink from Brigham Young University. This book, Essays on American Indian and Mormon History, is where I first presented some of my Haudenosaunee research. It's also where Elise Boxer's excellent article on the Book of Mormon as Mormon settler colonialism is located. And there's also a really valuable article by Lori Taylor, who is another scholar who has engaged in her dissertation, Haudenosaunee oral traditions in the Book of Mormon. So I highly recommend looking at these sources while you're waiting for my book to come out.
Fantastic. And you'll send me the links to all these, and I'll include these in the show notes as well. So
Well,
that's great.
I'll send you a link to the slideshow itself, which will have active links to all of these.
Excellent. Thank you,
So,
Thomas.
yeah, these are active links.
Wonderful.
Okay, so in the article, I use an actual historical event in the mid 20th century to highlight the damage that the narrative of the Book of Mormon can do to indigenous communities and has done. Okay, so this is something that did happen, and a lot of those of us from a settler background are completely unaware of an effort led by LDS politicians to eradicate indigenous sovereignty in the United States, and they legitimated it with the Book of Mormon itself. And so this was during the Eisenhower administration after World War II. And Utah Senator Arthur Watkins was the author of some of this legislation. He and his colleagues in the Senate wrote to put an end to the federal government's relationship with tribal governments by eliminating them, even though there had been treaties signed between the tribes and uh, the federal government. Uh, he viewed the treaties as anachronistic, as no longer relevant, and wanted to basically free the United States from its obligations that that it had made when it tried to acquire legal title to the indigenous lands that so many of us settlers live on today. And this is the way he described his work in a letter to LDS Church leadership in 1954.
Okay, this is Utah Senator Arthur Watkins. This is what he wrote.
Yes. Yes, he said, it seems to me that the time has come for us, he means settlers and the federal government particularly, to help American Indians stand on their own feet and become a white and delightsome people, as the Book of Mormon prophesied they would become. So he saw his work to eliminate tribal sovereignty as fulfilling this Book of Mormon prediction. And in fact, he found support from none other than Spencer W. Kimball, who is known as the prophet to the Lamanites in a sense, and is known for his work to undo the racial restrictions on blacks. But he held some pretty racist views towards American Indians at the same time that he loved them. And he stated in 1962, before he became president of the church, quote, "I firmly believe that tomorrow there will be no reservations. I look forward to the day." And I mean, when a critical indigenous scholar looks at this, they see the eradication of reservations, the eradication of tribal governments, the termination of them as a form of genocide.
Mm.
And so this is a hard thing for those of us from restoration traditions to wrestle with. We are enacting a violent appropriation of indigenous lands for our own benefit. And I will say that one of the things that fascinates me about the Book of Mormon is that I think Joseph Smith wrestled with these issues too. But I think what he tried to do was, I guess, ease his own consciousness by appropriating Haudenosaunee stories and Christianizing and whitewashing them. Now, when indigenous people are being directly affected, when their governments are being shut down, because this was actually started to be implemented, a number of tribal governments, such as the Menominee in Wisconsin, are getting physically shut down. In Utah, the Southern Paiutes, who Senator Watkins targeted for termination, some portions of the Utes, the mixed blood Utes, even the Catawba of South Carolina, who were predominantly LDS, were targeted by Arthur Watkins for termination. And this is how they remember that experience. So McKay Pickett, who's pictured here in the top picture, who's Southern Paiute, speaking about termination, reflected, "We were supposed to be equal to our white neighbors. Well, that didn't work out." When Joe's, and then he continues this critique of how the Southern Paiutes before had a very successful farming and ranching operation that after they were terminated, they ended up losing the farm, and it was devastating economically for them. And so, then he says, another thing, we ain't Lamanites. And he says, when Joseph Smith was back east, he met an Indian guy back there, asked about Indian religion, and he wrote it down. Now, Pickett said he heard this in Wisconsin, which, remember, this is where the Oneidas were relocated to. And very possibly from some of this Haudenosaunee oral traditions about Joseph Smith. Wallace Mad Bear Anderson, who's pictured in the lower part, is probably the most prolific storyteller, spreading stories about Joseph Smith and followers of Handsome Lake. Joseph Smith getting his ideas for the Book of Mormon from followers of Handsome Lake. And he was a prominent activist against termination, and he spread stories about Seneca tutors of Joseph Smith far and wide. There's a version that Nicholas Vorman shared with the historian Laurie Taylor, who I mentioned earlier, in 1994, that noted that the Book of Mormon has, quote, too much emphasis on the Christian thing, more than there used to be, more than the way we passed it on, the Iroquois passed it on, the Seneca there to Joseph Smith, end quote. And so what they're saying is that if, if Senator Watkins really understood the Haudenosaunee traditions behind the Book of Mormon, they wouldn't be engaging in this process of termination.
Hmm.
And so that gets my curiosity, right? Okay, what are those differences between what was erased when it become there's too much emphasis on the creation or the Christian thing? What was erased from the Haudenosaunee tradition? Now, kind of a very legitimate question to ask, and one that I admit my perspective has changed on over time, because initially I was very skeptical of these stories. I did not believe that Joseph Smith had interacted with Indigenous peoples directly. Okay. In fact, one of my professors during graduate school, Richard White, had told me he didn't think it was likely that Joseph Smith had ever interacted with Indigenous peoples. And so that I kind of worked from that presumption until I started digging into the sources. When I started digging into the actual primary sources, in fact, the newspapers, the early local histories, told a different story. There were, in fact, Indigenous peoples in the founding communities of Mormonism, not just in Western New York, but in Vermont, New Hampshire as well. And so what I highlight in the article is some of the interactions between the Smith and Mack families and Indigenous peoples at Moores Indian Charity School, which was part of Dartmouth College. And so there were ample opportunities there for intercultural exchange between 1811 and 1816. So fairly early in Joseph Smith's life, his family was having intimate interactions with Haudenosaunee peoples.
And when did you first come across that, Thomas?
In the research of John Behrens, who published this stuff in John Whitmer, or the Historical Journal of the John Whitmer Historical Society, mm-hmm. and I this would have been about 10 years ago or so.
And of course, we know Dr. Randy Bell's kind of entertained some of this stuff too, as well, and has written some stuff on that and have come on to talk about it as well. So it's kind of the interest. The Dartmouth connection is something we're just kind of digging into, and it's really an interesting thing. So you're saying that Joseph would have been exposed to these stories quite possibly through his brother Hiram, who was attending at this time.
His brother and cousin. So his brother, older brother Hiram, and his cousin Steven Mack Jr. attended classes with the Kanawake Mohawk Lewis Langford, with the Akwesasne Mohawk John Wheel, and with three Senecas, Jacob Jameson, James Stevenson, and John Whalebone. And I've done the most research on Jacob Jameson because he's particularly interesting because he not only would have interacted with the Smith family in Vermont, New York, but I mean Vermont, New Hampshire, but very likely would have in New York as well. And so Jacob Jameson, after studying at Moores Indian Charity School, returns to Buffalo Creek in 1817, where he studied medicine and he worked as an interpreter traveling throughout the region. And as he's doing that, his supervisor, Jasper Parrish, is in Canandaigua, just down the road from the Smith family in Manchester. And so likely they were still interacting. And in fact, Hiram used to go to Canandaigua regularly to pay the mortgage on his farm. And so there's ample opportunities for the two of them to continue to collaborate. The Senecas would travel, and often with the use of interpreters like Jacob Jameson, they would stop in Gananoque, which is their term for Palmyra, to hunt and fish in the Gananoque Valley, which local histories say was also a favorite fishing spot for the Smith brothers. So they were in the same places, and very likely these Haudenosaunee. So if there's validity to the Haudenosaunee stories, then you need to have the Indigenous people and the Smith family together in the same place. Otherwise, it doesn't make a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went through the historical sources, there's clear evidence that the Joseph Smith and Lucy Mack families had interactions with Native peoples, and that those interactions continued over a long period of time, and that they could very well have shared these stories with Joseph Smith. Even the famous Seneca Order Red Jacket, who's pictured here, spoke at the Palmyra Academy in July of 1822 to much acclaim. And he was best known for a speech he gave in response to another Dartmouth alum, Reverend Jacob Cram, where he basically says that if the Indians have their own religion, and that if God wanted to give them the Bible, he would have given it to them directly, would have given them their own book, like the Bible. And so this widely known speech may itself have helped to inspire the idea of the Book of Mormon as an indigenous complement to the Bible.
Okay, so who is saying that
Red Jacket.
natives, the Red Jacket was saying that they would have had their own version of the Bible?
Yeah.
And he's saying that, and he makes his way to Palmyra. And okay, so even folks, even if we can't directly connect the Smith Mack family to these individuals, they're in the same place, same time, and these would have been conversations that people would have been having, even talking about these things. So it's really interesting. So, but we also know physically they were in the same place, same time, and so there would have been at least some direct or indirect cross-pollinization probably going on here. So
it makes it
yeah,
very plausible that these stories could have some element of truth to them. There's another possibility, though, that has to be considered, and that is, could Joseph Smith have got this material from printed sources? And as I was investigating that question, and actually kind of late in the process, I came across a statement by a very famous Mormon historian, Dale Morgan. He's one of the correspondents with Fawn Brodie, for example, in the 40s. And he was writing his own epic history of Mormonism that did not get published because he died, unfortunately, an early death. But he had suggested as early as the 1940s that a certain book by David Cusick, a Tuscarora scholar, called Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations, comprising a tale of the foundation of the great island, now North America, the two infants born, and the creation of the universe. That this book, or pamphlet, more appropriately a pamphlet, that was published in Lewiston, New York in 1827, and advertised in newspapers in Canandaigua, and we can see the newspaper advertisement here on the screen, may have been the catalytic agent inspiring the Book of Mormon. And so we have a catalyst theory for the Book of Mormon that emerged in the 1940s, but has been largely ignored by scholars because Dale Morgan never published it. It would only be published in the 1980s by an editor editing some of his early work. And it sat in a library in California for many years, and people didn't notice it. And so there is a possibility that a lot of the similarities between Haudenosaunee stories and the Book of Mormon came from Joseph Smith reading David Cusick. He could have also met David Cusick, and in fact, they later send missionaries to the Tuscarora Reservation and meet with the Cusick family. Okay, so he could have met Cusick and heard it directly and read the material, but many, but not all, of the similarities to Haudenosaunee oral traditions can be found in Cusick. And so that we do need to keep open that possibility that Joseph Smith was reading this material as well as interacting. And what's important about Cusick's work is how it reshapes the Haudenosaunee narratives. So Cusick's Sketches of the Ancient History of the Six Nations is the first published account to attribute the Iroquois Great Law of Peace to a deity. And he uses Teheron Hiowakan, the holder of the heavens, as that deity. He doesn't name him specifically as Jesus, although there is a Jesus-like old man in the book with it, in which he also has the first written Iroquois account of a Jesus-like old man who spoke of people across the water murdering their maker, a narrative that's echoed 3 years later in the Book of Mormon. And so we have an evolution in the literary record of Haudenosaunee tradition that happens just before the Book of Mormon. And it's incorporated into the Book of Mormon. If we look at the earlier sources, as I said previously, Ayanhuatha, Sikonsase, and Tekanawita are human founders in all accounts of the League's founding published prior to 1827. There is, though, interestingly, an unpublished 1816 account that also deifies the human founders. And that author, John Norton, was a Cherokee man who was adopted by a Mohawk man by the name of, why am I blanking on his name? Joseph Brandt, who was also an alumnus of Moore's Indian Charity School. So this unpublished account shows that the idea was the evolution in the story, this deification of the founders, it probably happened in the decade or so before the publication of the Book of Mormon. But we don't see it in earlier accounts.
Now, I just understand. Was David Cusick, was he also Indigenous himself?
Yes, he was Tuscarora.
Okay, so this is a person who's writing these things. He's not some white person writing about these and projecting things onto it. This is an individual who's telling these stories from his own people. Okay, excellent.
Right. He's collecting and translating these stories. And so what you see is that the Book of Mormon reflects a particular time in the evolution of the narrative. And that time is in the late 1820s. Okay. And it's possible it could go back to 1816 in the time of the Moore's Indian Charity School as well. So it's possible he could have heard it there. That's why that timing of 1816 is so important. But it's interesting that in the Second Great Awakening, basically, what you have is a religious movement that's affecting settlers. It's also affecting Indigenous people. And Indigenous people are also rethinking and retelling their narratives in a way that transforms ordinary humans into a Jesus-like peacemaker. Now, there's another book that of particular interest, and especially for those interested in Ojibwe traditions, because this author, Henry Schoolcraft, married an Ojibwe woman and lived in Sault Ste. Marie, which is connected to the ancestral communities of David Taylor. And so this author, Henry Schoolcraft, was an ethnographer. He's a very prolific ethnographer. He's written a lot about Ojibwe traditions. And for those that are interested in Midewiwin traditions, he's one of the excellent scholars on it. And that becomes quite relevant to David Taylor's story, because you hear him talking a lot about similarities between Ojibwe lodge traditions and the Mormon temple ceremonies, as well as the peacemakers. Well, Henry Schoolcraft shows how these ideas were adapted from Masonry in the 18th and 19th centuries in Ojibwe tradition. So he was right there observing it and recording it as it was happening. So anyway.
Fascinating. Yeah. Of course, I kind of have a connection to Schoolcraft in the sense that we had a cottage near Sault Ste. Marie, Michigan. We also had a place in Elgin, Michigan, which was named by Henry Schoolcraft. Using it, he named many, many towns in Michigan, and there's also a Schoolcraft, Michigan, that I've been through as well. So he's Schoolcraft was a very important person who was really documenting a lot of things. He may have gotten a lot of things wrong too, but he did a lot of really important work back then.
Yeah, for sure. And his book, Notes on the Iroquois, is one I definitely recommend people interested in digging deeper take a look at. This version that he presents there was an oral Onondaga version recorded in 1845 by the historian Joshua Clark. It does have some similarities with the Book of Mormon that aren't in Cusick. So like it's a little more rapturous, a little more dramatic, like the descending from heaven scenes, those sort of things are more reminiscent of the oral tradition that's in Schoolcraft than in Cusick. And so that that's interesting. So that kind of lends a little more credence to the idea that Joseph Smith heard these stories orally. And in fact, an interesting thing that especially your Mesoamerican scholars will be interested in hearing is that Henry Schoolcraft called the Peacemaker and the Onondaga version the Iroquois Quetzalcoatl, and shows connections to Mesoamerican traditions as well.
Fascinating.
So I've gone a little longer than I was hoping. So let me kind of wrap a couple of key points I want to reemphasize. In the Iroquois Great Law of Peace, Mohawks, Oneidas, Cayugas, and Senecas came together around a central fire at Onondaga, and they did not forfeit their national identities, like you see in the Book of Mormon. They did not stop being Mohawk. They did not stop being Onondaga. They operate through a system of consensus that essentially grants matrilineal clan mothers and their representatives veto power over Confederacy decisions. So the role of women in the politics is completely absent in the Book of Mormon, but it's present in the Haudenosaunee traditions. And women were very powerful and controlled the traditional lands. So you get the Haudenosaunee Great Peace maintains national sovereignty amidst confederated unity. So if Senator Watkins had been looking at this tradition instead of the Book of Mormon, there wouldn't have been a need to eliminate tribal sovereignty to unify people. That people can bring their culture to the unity that the Peacemaker is trying to create in Haudenosaunee traditions. The Book of Mormon's version erases national identities and mentions neither the matrilineal kinship nor the sovereign political power maintained by clan mothers. It claims there were no manner of ites except white Nephites who absorb and replace the dark-skinned Lamanites. Now, no authentic Haudenosaunee traditions depict the Peacemaker as white, like the Book of Mormon does. But there are two secondhand settler colonial accounts from the 20th century that join the Book of Mormon in misappropriating and whitewashing Iroquois traditions of the Peacemaker. And I know you discussed one of these with Chief Midegah. He walked the Americas. L. Taylor Hanson was a science fiction writer, and she collected a bunch of stories and put them together in something that I grew up in Southern Idaho reading. I remember using it in a sacrament meeting talk because it was such a powerful influence on me. Well, I was disappointed in my research, particularly when I looked at her passage about the Seneca stories that she calls the Pale Hiawatha, that she has a lot of contradictory detail. Her source was an actor. It was recorded many years later. And it shows a lot of the assumptions that she made was based on that she held those assumptions before she heard the story. And she even admits that, well, he didn't really say it was a pale prophet, but the story was told in a different context. So if you read her work carefully and critically, it's a bit problematic. She assumed that the Peacemaker was a white person who was bearded and walked the Americas.
And I think what's interesting is I've engaged this book. This is a book that I was familiar with growing up as well. And this L. Taylor Hanson was not a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So it goes to show, just so people understand. And look, growing up, I knew people that believed that Native Americans were descended from the 10 lost tribes. So these stories also are part of the evangelical tradition as well. This isn't just a Mormon thing. And so I think so to kind of come across almost the same conclusion that there is this white bearded Christ-like figure that engaged Native Americans is something that's not just exclusive to the Book of Mormon. I also point out the ministry in Gravette, Arkansas, what's their name? Murray. His name's Murray. He also, and he comes from a more fundamentalist Christian background, the Shepherd's Chapel. They've used these very same materials as well. They've never used the Book of Mormon, but they've used these materials to also tell a similar story. So this is not just exclusive to the Restoration.
Very important point. So, in my conclusion to the article, and then I'll offer some more direct reflections on David Taylor and his claims. I argue that a Christian utopia in which there are no ites except whites is a classic example of a settler colonial fantasy. It's a way for Europeans to feel like they belong in stolen land. The malleable racial body in the Book of Mormon is better described as a 19th century settler colonial construct than something akin to a novel postmodern perspective, which is the term used by Max Mueller. The presumption that whiteness is non-racial is a dangerous interpretation that has done, is doing, and will continue to do significant harm to Indigenous communities in settler colonial societies. And the scripture's white universalism is more accurately recognized as a settler colonial erasure of indigeneity. Now let's talk about David Taylor's claim, the claim he made on your show and has made on others, that the Peacemaker narrative validates the Book of Mormon. And in other shows, he said that there's no way Joseph Smith could have known about the Peacemaker. He was incorrect in that. Joseph Smith could very well have known about the Peacemaker through, according to Haudenosaunee oral tradition. They attribute the similarities between the Peacemaker narratives and the Book of Mormon to Joseph Smith's misappropriation of their stories. And the representations of a pale peacemaker, and I'm not accusing David Taylor of calling the peacemaker white, because I haven't, or even calling Jesus white. I haven't heard him say that. But those that do, that represent the peacemaker as white, who walk the Americas, is also a whitewashing of Indigenous traditions. That's not legitimated by the Indigenous traditions themselves. There is something that David Taylor has been doing as well that makes me a little bit nervous. I've heard him tell his audience that they can be Anishinaabe, a part of the original people through covenant. And that reminds me of the Book of Mormon's depiction of the family of Lehi as original and the people of Nephi as whites without ites. It's, in a sense, telling his settler colonial Zionists that they can be Indigenous. That makes me a little bit uncomfortable. And it seems to have more settler colonial than Indigenous roots. And I read the Book of Mormon as a settler colonial gospel that needs and invites decolonization by reading it alongside Indigenous scriptures. And this is where I think David Taylor is actually making a great contribution to the Restoration, in that he's encouraging people to read Indigenous sacred narratives alongside the Book of Mormon. And I applaud him for that. So for those who want to read my article to follow up the sources, you can download it again at dialoguejournal.com. You can listen to my author's reading available at Latter Daily Digest or on my channel, Dr. T.W. Murphy on YouTube. And those who want to dig even deeper into the book, there's a 25% discount if you order directly from the university, or pre-order directly from the University of Utah Press before April 30th using the QR code here on the screen. And I invite you to check out the book.
All right. Well, put your phones up there, get the discount code. I just checked it earlier. It works just fine. And you can also get some quotes, some more information on the book, and some of the people who have endorsed the book as well. Read what they have to say about it as well. So is that it for the presentation, Thomas?
That is.
All right. Why don't you exit out and we'll just wrap things up here. First of all, thank you for coming on to the show today to talk about this really important topic. And actually, you applaud David Taylor, Chief Midegah. And I think that's good that you did that, because I think he is bringing something to the table in the sense that, we need to listen to Indigenous voices alongside all the voices of the Restoration. And I think that's important that we have that conversation, because it appears that, the Book of Mormon's having a conversation with the Bible. The Book of Mormon's having a conversation with indigenous traditions, and it's all tied in very interestingly. And I think that if we take the Book of Mormon out of its cultural context that it came out of, you're only getting just a very superficial view of the text. And to better understand the translator, to better understand Joseph Smith's world, and how that would have influenced the text. And even Jonathan Neville, faithful Latter-day Saint, admits, and doesn't admit, but says that yes, the translator is going to have an effect on the translation. You can't, there's no way around that. And even Brigham Young said if the Book of Mormon came about at a different time, it would be a different record. It would be different. So even they recognize, even Brigham Young recognized the importance of the time and place that the Book of Mormon came forth, and the cultural influences would be on that. So this is not necessarily being critical. It's actually, it's acknowledged by a prophet within the Restoration as well. Thomas, this was a really interesting presentation you gave. There's a lot. My wheels are turning. This will probably even lead to me making a couple phone calls with you in the next couple of weeks to kind of digest everything that you presented today. It was fantastic. Thanks again for coming on. And do you have any final words you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, I look forward to coming back and talking with some of the scholars doing this leading work, such as Elise Boxer and Suhei Vega, who are good friends of mine and doing incredible work. And again, I don't expect everybody to agree with my conclusions. I come from the perspective of professional anthropologist. I am a scientist. I look at things critically, and I'm also a European settler descendant as well, and that's my predominant identity. I am also fascinated by these stories of Iroquois ancestry, and they've led me to dig much deeper into Haudenosaunee traditions. And I've spent my career working alongside Indigenous peoples in lots of collaborative projects over the years. And I have learned much from them. I have much more to learn. And so I look forward to learning together with you and your listeners as we interview some excellent scholars in the months to come.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So, so we're going to have Indigenous voices represented more now here at MBR. I think it's really important. I do feel that's probably a blind spot on my part. And Thomas has been really an important voice in educating me throughout the years about these stories and these connections that I find absolutely just intriguing and want to continue down this path. A lot of people want to kind of crack the code of how all this came to be, how the Book of Mormon was created. And I think we'll be having these conversations for a long, long time to come, but you bringing something to the table. And really what this does is that Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon, and even Chief Midegah are demanding we have this conversation. Mm-hmm. And I think I'm glad we had it today. Thomas, I really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay, folks. Well, we're going to have links in the description to everything that we talked about, including the slideshow, which will have live links that you'll be able to access all the information that was in there. Also, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, we do have links in the description there as well. Of course, with the water flask, there's the promo code for 10% off. Again, I'm not getting any money for it. Just you're getting it 10% off for that water flask, which I think has been very helpful to me. But the most important thing is this: all the voices of the Restoration and Indigenous voices will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.